I'm here to tell you how graphic design can change the world. Before I became an academic, I was a graphic designer and cartoonist. I moved into academia because I realised that if I could teach a whole new generation of students how to change the world through design, it would have a much bigger impact than if it was just me. I'll talk a bit later about what impact graphic designers might have in 70 years' time. But first, what even is graphic design and how can it change the world? Well, I'm glad I asked. Communicating through images and text has been around for thousands and thousands of years. Up until recently, most of that communication has been written or spoken. In Greek and Roman society, speakers recited news and political arguments and so on to persuade people. Up until about 500 years ago and the invention of the printing press, that was the main way to spread news. The printing press and the mass production of books and other printed stuff changed everything. Still, most of the information up until now has mostly been written. Graphic design really came of age in the 1900s, when groundbreaking technology finally allowed image and text to be printed together really cheaply and really quickly. This meant an explosion of hand-drawn fonts, big headings, big posters, logos, political cartoons, and images of current events. Print changed from a craft to design by daring artists like Toulouse-Lautrec. Artist designers in the Russian Revolution used cartoons to communicate because a full half of the population couldn't read. This empowered 80 million people. Communication is how we see history, and graphic design is what makes it readable, understandable, compelling. Let me give you an example. You might have heard of Florence Nightingale. She's regarded as the founder of modern nursing and for improving sanitation in war hospitals. But she was also a pioneer in infographic design. Publishing her report in 1858, Nightingale worried that statistics were a little bit dry, a bit dull. So she included an infographic that she invented. Here it is here. Deaths from preventable diseases are the blue bits, battle wounds are the red bits, and black is all the other causes of death. You can see that preventable disease sections are way bigger than battle wounds once the soldiers arrived at the battlefields. This showed that disease, rather than battle wounds, was the real threat. Before that, Nightingale had helped care for some patients from a really bad cholera outbreak near Broad Street in central London. The worldwide cholera pandemic had started about 10 years ago and had killed 10,000 people in London that year alone. Over 3 days, 127 people died and people were fleeing. And at the time in 1854, medical opinion was that bad air was the cause. A physician called John Snow, who clearly knew something, suspected it might be contaminated water, but his ideas were ignored. He used another data visualisation, this time a dot map, that clearly demonstrated clusters of cases around one specific water pump in Broad Street. I've highlighted the pump in the blue circle here. So with this infographic, he convinced authorities to close the pump and the global outbreak ended. Snow's work led to the end of the pandemic and is the founding event of epidemiology, which is a cornerstone, a really important part of modern public health. In both of those cases, graphic design was the key that persuaded people and changed the world. So how can graphic design change us now? We communicate really differently now, especially in the last 20 years. It's much more a combination of image and text. Experts estimate that we see thousands of marketing messages every single day. But it's not just advertising, it's your books, your newspapers, anything in a package, airport signage, road signs, coffee cups, and most of all, your device screens. We Aussies spend an average of 9 hours out of a 24-hour day looking at screens. We're looking at screens longer than we're asleep. And designers are making this experience for you. I'm talking about how it looks, what the colours are, what the fonts are, the layout, or where everything sits. That little red notification that gives you a rush because someone wants to connect with you. the desktops, the apps, the emoticons. I spoke earlier about Greek and Roman speakers. Well, they used a set of rules and techniques to make their messages persuasive, and that's called rhetoric. One technique of rhetoric is repetition, and an example is repeating three-word slogans like you'd hear in politics, like 4 more years, yes we can, have a go, get a go, stop the boats, lock her up, send her back, under his eye. It makes it easy to remember them, to chant them. Well, visual rhetoric is applying those same rules to the visual messages. And one of the most powerful tools in visual rhetoric is two-dimensional imagery, like logos or cartoons. These simple, flat images increase our ability to remember the company or the message that they're representing. Simple logos like McDonald's, Apple, Nike, Mickey Mouse, Pokemon, they stick in your mind. And I don't need an image here because it's likely you may recall at least one of those quite easily. A recent study in the UK found that kids could name more Pokemon characters than common wildlife in their backyards. What's really scary about rhetorical techniques like repetition and 2D imagery is that the easier something is to remember, the more likely we are to trust it, to believe it. As well, images make a more emotional response, where written or spoken tends to make us think a bit more logically. My research has shown that how a message looks can have more meaning than what the message actually says. Here's an example of the same message styled in two different ways. The first looks like a government message. The second does not. And one of the reasons is that people use the aesthetic style of the message or how it looks to judge who it is delivering that message. This can change your opinion regardless of what it says. In my study, I interviewed a bunch of people and I showed them some graphic design visuals about climate change. I talked to people who did not think climate change was caused by humans, and to others who did, and a few in between. Some of the people who said they believed in climate change were convinced that one of the graphics I showed them was from an oil company. It wasn't, but they didn't trust it. They didn't believe. This is it here. And a lot of it was because of this little graphic. It was just meant to be a decoration. This flat, simple image stood out. It was easy to remember. They believed that rather than what the text said. But the colours were a problem too. They thought it was too corporate, too slick. One stated that the message wasn't emotional enough. We seem to be expressing emotions in our communications much more than ever before. Interestingly, they thought this one was emotional because of the image, and then funny because of the text. This one seemed to unite people. It changed the way they received the message. Let's go back to those emoticons. The most used emoticon in 2018 was the laugh cry face, followed by love heart eyes, then cry cry. These are pure, strong emotions, laughing so hard that you cry, or love, one of the strongest and most sought after emotions in the human experience. We fling these about in modern digital communications without batting an eyelid. Well, Susan Kerr was a graphic designer for Apple back in the 80s. She designed lots of graphic user interface icons and fonts that we still use. We don't even think about them because they're now part of our language. The same goes for pictograms like toilet signs. We don't need words, and sometimes we can figure out what the pictogram is without needing them. And when you really need to go, figuring out where to go is super important. So how does all this build into a future 70 years from now? We're already looking at our screens 9 hours a day. We may not be looking at outdated technology like screens, but it's likely we'll still be interacting with some kind of designed visual world. Let's imagine we did drastically cut our carbon emissions, say next year in 2020. Maybe a graphic design campaign like Florence Nightingale's infographic is finally compelling enough for us all to step up and make change. Well, the temperature is still going to soar, but maybe not to catastrophic levels. This will be a hot, harsh environment, and many other problems like antibiotic-resistant superbugs mean we can't be outside for long. We'll survive in cleverly designed tiny houses, spending most of our time in visual spaces and social media to build solutions, to solve problems, to hang out. In this future virtual world, our language will have continued to move away from mostly spoken and written. We'll snapshot, we'll annotate imagery, we'll animate, use memes and acronyms like LOL, and emoticons like some sort of modern-day hieroglyphics. We're already doing it. The visual landscape where this online social life happens is designed by graphic designers. Think of Minecraft. You can build the world any way you want it, but only with the tools we design for you. Every interaction will be guided by persuasive visuals by designers. Remember, images are more emotional, so with images dominating our language, what kind of changes would that make in us? Will our emotions and our emoticons be wildly melodramatic and emotional by 2089? Maybe something mildly amusing will leave us screaming with laughter and bashing our fists on a nearby tiny wall. Or will that just be the emoticon we use to communicate a light chuckle? What's not in doubt is that the power of graphic designers in this visual space will be huge. We will have the power to make you believe. Thank you.